let me tell you about the 29th of December 1980. The end of that year in America had a particular texture to it. The hostages were still in Tehran. The president-elect had not yet taken office. Gas had been expensive for so long that people had stopped being surprised by it. The Cold War, which everyone talks about now as though it were an abstraction, a chess match between two capitals, was in that period an ordinary background condition of daily life, like weather. There were bases everywhere. There were aircraft overhead constantly. In wide stretches of the American South, people learned to identify military helicopters by sound, the way farmers learned to identify rain by smell. And nobody thought that was remarkable because it was not. Southeast Texas in late December is not the Texas of postcards. There is no desert here, no red rock, no cactus standing in silhouette. Northeast of Houston, the land goes green and wet and close. This is the edge of the piney woods, where loblolly and slash pine grow thick and tall and crowd right up against the shoulders of the two-lane roads. The pines do not open up the way oaks do. They form walls. At night, driving through them, your headlights carve a tunnel, and the tunnel moves with you, and everything outside of it is simply gone. The air that evening was cool and damp. Not cold, not really. Not the way people from farther north understand cold, but that heavy Gulf Coast dampness that settles into the fabric of your coat and stays there. The kind of night where the windshield fogs if you breathe wrong, where the pavement holds a thin sheen even though it has not rained in hours. Betty Cash was 51 years old. She ran a small business. She was, by every account of the people who knew her, a practical woman, the kind who handled her own problems, who did not go looking for attention, and would not have known what to do with it if it arrived. Vickie Landrum was 57, worked as a waitress, and had her grandson Colby with her that evening. Colby was 7. 7-year-olds do not have a category for anything, which is part of why his reactions later became so important to the people who studied this case. A 7-year-old does not know what he is supposed to see. The 3 of them had gone out to look for a place to eat and to play bingo, and both of those small, ordinary plans had come to nothing. The restaurants they tried were closed. Holiday week, that dead stretch between Christmas and New Year, when half the world locks its doors and forgets to tell you. So they turned the car around and started back toward Dayton, Texas, on a farm-to-market road running through the woods. I want you to hold on to that detail for a moment, because it is the detail that makes the entire story what it is. They were driving home from a cancelled dinner. Nobody was out looking for anything. Nobody had a camera. Nobody had an interest in the subject. No prior belief system to confirm. No reason to be anywhere except on that road at that hour. Tired and mildly annoyed that the evening had not worked out. Whatever they encountered it the way you encounter a deer in the road. Without preparation, without framework, without any of the mental scaffolding that would have let them file it away neatly afterward. That is, I think, the single most important thing about the Cash-Landrum case, and it is the thing that keeps serious people coming back to it decade after decade. The witnesses had nothing to gain. They gained nothing. What happened to them afterward, they would not have wished on anyone. The car moved through the tunnel of pines. The heater was running. Somewhere ahead of them, past a curve, past a stand of trees, something was already in the sky above the road. They had not seen it yet. They had, at that moment, perhaps 2 minutes left of an ordinary life. The light appeared through the trees first. That is how every version of the account describes it, and it is worth pausing on, because it tells you something about the geometry of the moment. They did not look up and see something in the open sky. They saw a glow moving between trunks, flickering as the pines interrupted it, the way sunlight strobes through a fence when you drive past. Vickie noticed it. She thought, at first, that it might be an aircraft coming in low. There are airports around Houston. Low aircraft are not strange. Then the road bent, and the trees opened. And it was not an aircraft. It was above the road ahead of them, not off to the side, not in the distance, not near the horizon. Above the road, hanging there at what the witnesses estimated as something like the height of the treetops, or a little above them, close enough that it filled the windshield rather than sitting in a corner of it. Their descriptions of the shape have been repeated and refined and argued about for over 40 years, but the core of it has stayed consistent. Something like a diamond, or two cones joined at their wide ends, tall rather than wide, bright along its surface with a light that was not steady. And beneath it, periodically, in bursts, an enormous downward emission of flame, not a beam, not a spotlight, flame. Vickie described it later as though the thing was sitting on a column of fire that appeared and disappeared. When the fire came, the object rose slightly. When the fire stopped, it sank. Rose, sank, rose, sank. A slow, labouring rhythm like something breathing hard. Betty stopped the car. Understand what a strange decision that is, and how completely ordinary it also is. If you have ever come around a curve and found something inexplicable in your path, you know that the body stops the car before the mind decides anything. She stopped roughly 200 feet short of it, or thereabouts. The estimates vary, and for a moment all three of them just looked. Then the heat arrived. This is the detail that separates the Cash-Landrum case from nearly every other encounter report in the literature, and it is the reason we're all still talking about it. The witnesses did not report a strange feeling. They did not report a sensation of being watched, or a hum, or missing time. They reported heat. Physical, radiant, unmistakable heat, coming through the windshield of a stopped car into the faces of three people in the middle of a December night. Betty got out. I have thought about that a great deal. Vickie stayed in the car and pulled Colby to her, because Colby was screaming, because he was 7 and something enormous and on fire was hanging over the road. But Betty got out. She walked a few steps toward the front of the vehicle and stood there looking up. Why? I think, honestly, that the answer is the least mysterious part of this entire story. She got out because she wanted to see it. Because some part of a person, confronted with the impossible, wants to look at it properly, without glass in the way. Because we are a species that walks toward the strange thing. It is how we got everywhere we have ever gotten, and it is how a great many of us have died. And on that night on that road, it was the difference between what happened to Vickie and Colby and what happened to Betty Cash. She stood outside for a matter of minutes. Nobody has ever pinned down exactly how long. Long enough for the heat to be uncomfortable. Long enough, according to the later accounts, that when she went back to the car, the door handle burned her hand. When she reached to open it, she had to pull her fingers away. Vickie, inside, had put her hand on the dashboard. The account of the dashboard is one of the small physical details that investigators found interesting, because it suggested that the interior of the vehicle had genuinely become hot enough that the vinyl retained a mark where a hand had pressed into it. Think about what that means for a moment. Whatever was over that road was radiating enough energy to heat the metal skin of a car from a distance measured in tens of yards. Colby wanted to go. He was pulling at his grandmother, telling her to run, and she was holding him, and telling him it was all right, and she was almost certainly not telling him the truth. And then, slowly, the object began to move. It lifted. It drifted upward and away, out over the trees with that same laboured rhythm, fire and pause and fire again. And the three of them, back inside the car now, began to breathe. That should have been the end of the story. A strange light, a strange machine, a strange night. It would have been one more entry in a filing cabinet somewhere, one more account that gets summarised in 2 sentences in a book about unexplained phenomena, and Betty Cash would have gone home and gone to bed and gotten up the next morning and gone to work. But it was not the end of the story, because that was when the helicopters arrived. Not 1, not 2. They came from multiple directions, converging on the object, and there were a great many of them. Betty later put the number at around 23. Vickie counted differently. Estimates from other people who reported seeing helicopters in the area that night vary as well, which is exactly what you would expect from human beings looking up at a night sky full of moving lights and rotor noise. But every account agrees on the essential facts. There were many. They were low, and some of them had 2 rotors. 2 rotors matters. A tandem-rotor helicopter is not a subtle aircraft. It is not something you mistake for a news chopper or a police unit or a private machine belonging to an oil company. In 1980, in the United States, a large twin-rotor helicopter meant essentially one thing, and that thing was the CH-47 Chinook, and the Chinook meant the military. Full stop. There is no ambiguity in that silhouette. It is a school bus with rotors at both ends. Even at night, even from below, the shape and the sound of it are unmistakable, and Vickie Landrum, who had lived her entire life in a part of the country thick with military aviation, said Chinooks. Betty pulled the car forward. She drove out from under the trees and stopped again where she could see, and the three of them watched a formation of military helicopters move across the Texas sky in the company of something that none of them could identify. The helicopters were not attacking it. They were not circling it warily. They were not scrambling to intercept it. They were going with it, and that is the moment, right there, the hinge on which this entire case turns. Because in that instant, sitting in a hot car on a dark road with her hand still stinging, Betty Cash formed an impression that she never let go of for the rest of her life. Whatever that thing was, the United States military already knew about it. They were not surprised by it. They had brought equipment. They had brought a great deal of equipment in the dark in the last week of December over a rural county road in southeast Texas. The formation moved off toward the southwest, and the sound faded, and the sky went back to being a sky, and three people drove home. The drive home was quiet in the way that only a car full of people who have just seen the same impossible thing can be quiet. Betty dropped Vickie and Colby off. She went home, and within a few hours she began to be sick. It started the way ordinary sickness starts, which is part of why nobody understood it at first. Nausea, a headache, that heavy, wrung-out feeling that makes you assume you have caught something. She lay down. She did not sleep well. By the following morning it was no longer ordinary. Her skin had begun to blister. Her face and neck were swollen. Her eyes were swollen, nearly shut and streaming, and the whites of them had gone red. She was vomiting and could not stop. Over the following days blisters broke and wept. Patches of her hair came out in her hand when she touched her head. She lost her appetite entirely. Her energy simply left, the way water leaves a cracked glass. Betty Cash spent much of the following weeks in a hospital. Vickie Landrum was sick too. Less severely, but along the same lines. Skin problems, eye problems, hair loss, nausea. Colby, the 7-year-old, had the mildest symptoms of the three, some skin irritation and eye trouble, but he had them. Now here is the pattern that would eventually obsess everyone who looked seriously at this case, and I want to lay it out plainly because it is the fulcrum. Betty was outside the car the longest. Betty was the most severely injured. Vickie was inside, but with the door open at first and closer to the windshield, holding a child. Vickie was moderately injured. Colby was pulled down and held against his grandmother, shielded by an adult body and a car seat and a roof. Colby was the least injured. That is a dose-response relationship. That is exactly the shape of exposure. If three people stand at three different distances from a source of energy for three different durations, and their injuries scale accordingly, then whatever hurt them was not psychological, was not coincidental, and was not a story. It was a source. It was radiating. And it did not care what anyone believed about it. The medical people who treated Betty in those first weeks were, understandably, working without a map. She had not been in an industrial accident. She had not been near a fire. She had no history that explained blistering, hair loss, gastrointestinal collapse and eye inflammation, all arriving together in the space of a day and a half. Some of the physicians who reviewed her records in the years afterward would note that the constellation of symptoms resembled what you might expect from a substantial exposure to ionizing radiation, or to a combination of ionizing radiation and intense infrared heat. Resembled. That word is doing a lot of work, and I want to be honest about it. Nobody ever conclusively established a cause. There was no dosimeter on that road. No one drew blood on the 29th of December to establish a baseline. By the time anyone with expertise was asking the right questions, weeks had passed and the kind of evidence that would have settled the matter, chromosome damage, blood count trajectories, was already muddied or gone. Skeptics have argued for decades that Betty's symptoms could have had another explanation, and they are not wrong to argue it, because in the absence of proof, argument is all anyone has. But here is what remains, stubbornly, after all the argument. 3 people who had no reason to lie were injured in a pattern consistent with exposure to a source of energy on a night when they reported standing under an unidentified machine emitting visible heat in the company of a formation of military helicopters. You can dispute the interpretation. It is very hard to dispute the shape. Betty Cash never fully recovered. Her health was poor for the rest of her life, and she died on the 29th of December 1998, 18 years to the day after the night on the road. I'm not going to make anything of that date. It is a coincidence, almost certainly, and coincidences are only meaningful to people who need them to be. But it is the kind of detail that, once you know it, you cannot quite unknow. In the months that followed the encounter, the case attracted attention. Investigators interviewed the witnesses repeatedly and found their accounts consistent, which is not something that can be said of every case in this field. Other people in the area came forward describing helicopter activity that night. Some described lights. A local law enforcement officer and his wife reported seeing a diamond-shaped object with helicopters around it in the same general time frame, which is a difficult thing to wave away, because he had a career to protect and nothing to gain. And so the question narrowed. Not what was the object. That question, in a sense, was never going to be answerable. Objects in the sky are unfalsifiable by nature. You cannot prove or disprove a shape that nobody photographed. The question that mattered was much smaller and much sharper. Where did the helicopters come from? That is the question that broke this case open, and it is the question that, 40-odd years later, still has no satisfying answer. Because here is the thing about helicopters, and I want you to sit with this because everything that follows depends on it. A UFO can be anything. It can be a misidentified planet, a hoax, a hallucination, a plasma phenomenon, a secret aircraft, or something genuinely beyond our understanding. It has no address. It has no maintenance schedule. A Chinook has all of those things. A CH-47 does not exist as a light in the sky. It exists as roughly 10 tons of machinery that requires 2 pilots and a crew chief, that burns hundreds of gallons of fuel per hour, that cannot fly for more than a few hours without stopping, that must be based somewhere, that must be fueled somewhere, that must be maintained by a team of mechanics who sign their names on forms. Every hour it flies is logged, every gallon it burns is accounted for, every takeoff and landing generates paper. Now multiply that by 20. If Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum saw what they said they saw, then on the night of December 29th, 1980, dozens of American military personnel were in the air over southeast Texas, and hundreds more were involved in getting them there and bringing them home. Fuel trucks, ground crews, flight planners, air traffic coordination. Somebody's commanding officer signed off, somebody's clerk typed the tasking, somebody, somewhere, filed the paperwork. That is not the kind of thing that vanishes. And yet when Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum went looking for it, it had vanished. They filed suit against the United States government. They asked, in effect, a simple question in a formal setting. You were there, and we were hurt. So who owns the helicopters? The government's position was, in essence, that no such operation could be identified. Representatives of the various services stated that they had no aircraft matching the description operating in that area that night. The Army said no, the Air Force said no, the Navy said no, the Coast Guard said no. The case was dismissed in 1986. The court found that the plaintiffs had not established that the object or the helicopters belonged to the United States government, and without that there was no claim. Read that carefully, because it is more interesting than it looks. The case did not fail because the court decided nothing had happened. It failed because the witnesses could not prove ownership. They could not prove whose helicopters those were. which means the legal system, in its dry procedural way, produced the exact same result as everything else in this story. It confirmed that something was there, and it confirmed that nobody would claim it. That is where the real story ends, and that is where I am going to leave the historical record and start building something on top of it. From this point forward, everything you hear is fiction. The names are invented, the programs are invented, the documents are invented. None of it happened, but it fits. And that, I have found, is the most unsettling kind of story there is. Dr. Nolan Price did not believe in flying saucers. He would say that to people, unprompted, in the tone of a man laying down a card before a game begins. He was an occupational physician who had spent most of his career in and around the aerospace industry along the Gulf Coast, which meant he had spent most of his career looking at what machines do to the bodies of the people who work near them. Hydrazine burns, solvent exposure, hearing loss, hands that no longer close properly. He had a filing cabinet full of the specific, unglamorous ways that human tissue loses arguments with engineering. He heard about Betty Cash the way physicians hear about most things, which is to say sideways, at the end of a conversation about something else. A colleague mentioned a woman up in the Dayton area, blistering hair loss, eyes swollen shut, and no exposure history that made any sense. The colleague mentioned it as a curiosity, a puzzle over coffee. Price asked to see the chart. What he expected going in was a chemical burn. That is the boring answer, and boring answers are almost always correct. Somebody spills something, does not realise how bad it is, and comes in 2 days later looking like the wrath of God. He had seen it 50 times. What he found in the chart was not a chemical burn. Chemical burns have geography. They follow the spill. They map to where the liquid touched, where it pooled in a sleeve, where it wickered into fabric. They are irregular and specific, and if you look at them long enough you can practically reconstruct the accident from the shape of the injury. Betty Cash's injuries had no geography. They were distributed by exposure, not by contact. Face, neck, forearms, scalp. The parts of her that had been pointed at something, and the systemic collapse underneath it, the vomiting, the exhaustion, the appetite that simply switched off, did not belong to a burn at all. Burns hurt the skin. They do not empty a person out from the inside. Price sat with the chart for a long time, and then he wrote a single word on a legal pad and looked at it. Dose, not a chemical. A field. Something that had been radiating in her direction, and had gone through her, and had left her looking like a woman who had stood too near the wrong part of a reactor. He drove up to see her. She was by then home, in the flat and diminished way that people are home after a long hospitalization. Thin, careful with her movements, wearing a scarf. Price had spent enough time with injured workers to know how to sit down without making a person feel like a specimen, and he sat down, and he asked her to tell him what happened. Here is what he noticed, and it is the thing that changed the direction of his life. She did not want to talk about the object. Everybody else wanted to talk about the object. Reporters wanted the shape. Investigators wanted the dimensions, the colour, the estimated altitude. People wrote to her with theories. The object was the interesting part, obviously, the part that belonged in a headline. But when Price asked her gently what she remembered from right before she started feeling sick, Betty Cash did not describe a diamond in the sky. She said the helicopters. She said she had never in her life heard anything that loud. She said the sound arrived in her chest before it arrived in her ears. She said they came in low and fast from more than one direction, like they had been called, like somebody had said go now, and that the sky over that road had been so full of aircraft that she stopped being frightened of the object and started being frightened of the helicopters. She said, and Price wrote this down verbatim and kept the page for the rest of his career, that it was not like being watched, it was like being cleaned up after. Price went home that night and did not sleep, and in the morning he started making phone calls, and that is how a man who did not believe in flying saucers became a permanent resident of the strangest story of the 20th century. He was not at first chasing a conspiracy. He was chasing a diagnosis. That distinction matters. Price wanted to know what had irradiated his patient, because if something was capable of doing that to a woman standing on a public road, then it was capable of doing it to somebody else, and physicians who take that seriously are the reason any of us survive industrial civilization. He began with the obvious candidates and eliminated them one at a time. Radar. High-powered military radar can absolutely cook tissue, and there are documented cases of technicians injured by it. But radar of that intensity does not travel. It comes from an installation, and there was no installation on that road, and there was no history of anyone else in that area being injured in the years before or after. Industrial isotope. There are sources used in oil field work in pipeline inspection that are genuinely dangerous when handled improperly. But a lost isotope source injures whoever picks it up and carries it in a pocket. It does not hover over a highway emitting flame, chemical inhalation. Ruled out by the pattern and by the fact that all three witnesses would have inhaled roughly the same thing while sitting in the same car, and their injuries scaled by exposure position instead. Fabrication. He considered it seriously because a good physician always considers it. But you cannot fabricate a blood picture, and you cannot fabricate the way a woman moves 8 months after the fact, and you cannot fabricate a 7-year-old with irritated eyes who did not have irritated eyes the week before, which left the thing he did not want to write down, that the source had been airborne, that it had been over the road, that whatever powered it was producing enough radiant and possibly ionizing energy that standing beneath it for a few minutes constituted a significant medical event, and that a formation of military helicopters had been flying escort for it. Price made one more call to a man he knew at a hospital in San Antonio who had spent time in the service handling occupational medicine for air crews. He described the case in general terms, no names, just a pattern. The man on the other end went quiet for a moment and then asked carefully whether Price was asking as a physician or as a friend. Price said both, and the man said, "I would let this one alone." That is all he said. Not a denial. Not a warning in the movie sense. No dark car outside the house. No anonymous phone call at midnight. Just a tired professional courtesy from someone who had spent enough years inside a system to know the shape of a closed door when he ran into one. Price did not let it alone. He called a reporter. Evelyn Sutter covered aviation. Not defence policy, not politics, not the glamorous end of the beat. Aviation. Contracts and airframes and the unromantic machinery of an industry that moved billions of dollars through the Texas Gulf Coast without most people noticing. She'd spent 11 years learning how to read a procurement document the way other people read a novel, and she had built her career on a single insight that she would have told you was not an insight at all, merely an observation about the world. Machines leave paper. You cannot fly an aircraft in the United States without generating a trail. Fuel is purchased, parts are ordered, hours are logged against airframes because engines have finite lives measured in hours and somebody has to know when the number comes due. Crews are paid, meals are provided, somebody signs for the hangar space. Even in the classified world, especially in the classified world, the paperwork does not stop. It merely changes hands. Secrecy is not the absence of records. Secrecy is the careful management of who gets to see them. So when a Houston area physician called her and described a woman with radiation pattern injuries in a formation of 20-odd helicopters over a farm road, Evelyn's first reaction was not excitement. It was that this would be easy, not the object. The object she set aside immediately and permanently because she had no methodology for objects. But the helicopters were an aviation story, and aviation stories were what she did, and a formation that size in that place at that hour was, in her professional judgment, the single easiest thing in the world to trace. She was wrong, and it took her about 6 weeks to understand how wrong. Let me walk you through what she actually did, because the texture of it is the point. She started with geography. Southeast Texas in 1980 was thick with military and quasi-military aviation. There were reserve units. There were National Guard aviation elements. There was a large Coast Guard presence on the Gulf. There was the enormous gravitational mass of the Manned Spaceflight Center southeast of Houston, with its own aircraft and its own logistics. There were Army and Air Force installations within reasonable ferry range in multiple directions. Any one of them could plausibly put helicopters in the air, but not 20, not at once, not at night, in the last week of December, over rural Liberty and Harris counties. 20 aircraft is not a mission. 20 aircraft is an operation, and operations of that size do not happen spontaneously, because helicopters are not cars. You cannot simply decide on a Monday evening to launch a formation. Crews have to be alerted. Aircraft have to be pulled from maintenance rotation. Fuel has to be staged. Somebody has to deconflict the airspace with civilian traffic, because Houston Intercontinental was right there, and you do not put a large low-level formation underneath one of the busiest approach corridors in the country without telling anyone. So Evelyn made her list and she started calling. The reserve unit told her they had nothing flying that night. She asked for the flight records anyway. They told her records of that vintage were retained elsewhere and gave her an address. She wrote to the address. The address wrote back and said the request should be directed to the unit. The guard element told her, politely, that they had no tandem-rotor aircraft assigned at that time, which was true and verifiable and useful and eliminated them. The Coast Guard was, by a distance, the most helpful of anyone she dealt with. They pulled what they had. They flew search and rescue over the Gulf constantly, and their aircraft were on record, and none of them were anywhere near Huffman on the 29th, and they told her so in writing with the specific weary courtesy of an organisation that gets asked strange questions regularly. The army was where it started to go sideways, not through hostility. This is the part that people always get wrong when they imagine what stonewalling looks like. Nobody threatened her. Nobody hung up. Everyone she spoke with was pleasant, and several of them were actively trying to help, and that made it worse, because it meant the wall was not made of people. It was made of structure. The public affairs officer at one installation told her that any aircraft operating in that area would have been under a different command's operational control, and gave her a number. The different command told her that aircraft assigned to them were, in that period, frequently attached to joint exercises administered by a third entity. The third entity confirmed that exercises had taken place in that general time frame, said the records were held by the participating units, and returned her to the first installation. She drew the circle on a legal pad once to be sure she was not imagining it, and then she looked at the circle for a while. Then she tried a different approach, the one that had never failed her. She stopped asking about aircraft and started asking about fuel. This was Evelyn Sutter's actual genius, and it is worth understanding, because it is how real investigative work gets done. Nobody protects the fuel records. Fuel is boring. Fuel is a commodity purchased in bulk by an accounting office that has never heard of your story and does not care about it. If 20 helicopters flew for several hours over southeast Texas, then somewhere there was a line item for a very large quantity of aviation kerosene delivered to a location that did not normally receive it. She spent 2 months on that. She found something. She found that in the last 2 weeks of December, 1980, an unusual volume of fuel had moved through a support arrangement associated with a small airfield in the eastern part of the state. The airfield was not a major installation. It was the kind of place with 2 hangars and a windsock and a caretaker. It had no business receiving that much fuel, and there was no exercise on any published schedule that explained it. She drove out there. The caretaker was a man in his 60s named, and I will remind you this entire portion is invented, Ray Mercer, and he had been at that airfield for 19 years, and he was happy to talk to her, because almost nobody ever came out there, and he was lonely. She asked him whether it ever got busy. He said, once. She waited. He said, right after Christmas that one year. They came in and told him to take the week. Paid week. He said he had never had a paid week off in his life, and he did not argue about it. but he came back on the 2nd of January and the grass around the ramp was flattened in a way grass does not flatten on its own, in wide circles, and the concrete had rubber on it, and somebody had left a stack of empty fuel drums stacked neater than he would have stacked them. Evelyn asked if he had reported it. He looked at her like she had asked whether he had reported the weather. "Reported it to who?" he said. "They own the place." She asked, "Who?" And Ray Mercer, caretaker, 19 years, shrugged and said the thing that Evelyn Sutter would later say was the single most honest sentence anyone said to her in the entire investigation. He said, "I never asked. You do not ask. You just take the week." It took Evelyn Sutter another year to find Warren Kessick, and she found him the way you find most people worth finding, which is by talking to enough of the wrong ones. Kessick had been an army aviator, heavy lift. He had spent his career flying and then commanding the aircraft that carry things, which is a specific and underappreciated corner of military aviation. Fighter pilots get films made about them. The people who fly cargo helicopters get artillery pieces slung under their airframes and told to put them on a mountain in bad weather. He had retired in the mid-1970s, come back briefly in an advisory capacity, and then retired again for good. And by the time Evelyn met him, he was living outside a small town in East Texas with a workshop full of half-finished projects and a dog with a grey face. He did not want to talk to her at first. He was not evasive about it. He simply said he had nothing useful and that people who told stories about their service years usually got the stories wrong. She left a card. She came back twice more over the following months, and on the third visit he made coffee, which she understood to be an answer. What he told her, sitting in a workshop that smelled of sawdust and motor oil, was not dramatic. That is what made it credible. He said that in the late autumn of 1980, heavy lift crews he knew had been placed on an unusual standby. Not a deployment, not an alert in the conventional sense. A standby, which in practical terms meant that a certain number of crews were told not to schedule leave, not to take their aircraft into deep maintenance, and to be available on short notice for a possible recovery operation. Standbys happen. They are ordinary. What was not ordinary was the wording. Kessick had seen the language himself because a friend of his had been read into the tasking and had grumbled about it in the way that people grumble about anything that interferes with December. The tasking said the crews might be required to support the recovery of sensitive aerospace material. Evelyn asked what that meant. Kessick said that in his experience it meant a crashed aircraft, usually one with something aboard that nobody wanted photographed. Reconnaissance equipment, cryptographic gear, occasionally a weapon. He had done that kind of work. You fly out, you sling the wreckage or the pieces of it, you carry it home, and you do not discuss it, and that is a Tuesday. Evelyn asked what made this one different. He said two things. The first was the size. The standby covered more airframes than a normal recovery would require. You do not need a formation to lift a downed helicopter. You need one heavy aircraft and a couple of support birds. This tasking had put a great many crews on the hook at once, spread across more than one unit, and when he had asked his friend about it, his friend had said that the number was not about lifting. It was about coverage, area, presence. The second thing was the designation. Kessick said he only heard it once, and he heard it in passing, and he never saw it printed on anything that he could later point to, which he was careful to emphasise, because he was the kind of witness who marks the limits of his own testimony. But he remembered the word because it was a strange word for a heavy lift tasking, and because it stayed with him. Nightfall. Now, I want to break the story for a moment, because this is one of those places where fiction and reality get close enough to touch, and it is worth being precise about which is which. Real classified programs do have names, and the names are frequently either deliberately meaningless or accidentally poetic. Real compartmentalized programs do work exactly the way Kessick described, with participants who know their own slice and nothing else. That structure is genuine. It is the ordinary architecture of secrecy in a large state, and it has been documented extensively in declassified material from the era. Project Nightfall is invented. It did not exist. Warren Kessick did not exist. But the shape of what I am describing to you, the way a real program of that kind would actually function, is not invented at all, and that is precisely why this story is unsettling rather than silly. So, Nightfall. According to what Kessick had pieced together over the years, from fragments and from conversations with men who had been closer to it than he was, Nightfall was not a program that studied anything. It did not investigate. It had no scientists, no laboratories, no analysis function. It was purely a response organisation. Its purpose was to be the thing that happens after something goes wrong. Think of it as the aerospace equivalent of a hazardous materials team, except that the hazardous material in question was whatever the classified world happened to be flying that year, and the team had to be able to reach it, secure it, and remove it before anyone with a camera arrived. The crews were not told what they were recovering. That was the whole point. A pilot who does not know what is in the sling cannot describe it, cannot leak it, and cannot be interrogated usefully about it. Their instructions, according to Kessick, were procedural rather than informational. Establish a perimeter, maintain visual contact, keep civilian traffic away from the axis of movement. Do not approach the object without protective equipment. Do not photograph. Do not transmit descriptions in the clear. On recovery, hand off to the receiving element and depart. Evelyn asked him about the protective equipment line because it was the one that did not fit. If you are recovering a crashed reconnaissance aircraft, you might need protective gear for fuel, for hydraulics, for the composites in the airframe that turn nasty when they burn. That is standard. But it is a ground concern. It applies to the recovery team on the dirt, not to the crews in the air. She asked whether air crews had ever been briefed on protective measures, and Kessick put his coffee down and said yes, and that was the part he had never liked. He said that crews attached to that kind of tasking were briefed in general terms that certain experimental vehicles could produce hazardous emissions during a propulsion failure. Not smoke, not fumes, emissions. He said the briefing language talked about maintaining standoff distance from the affected vehicle and about limiting time on station in close proximity, and that flight surgeons were to be notified if crews reported nausea, headache, or skin irritation following a mission. Evelyn asked him what he understood that to mean. Warren Kessick, who had flown helicopters for 22 years and who did not believe in flying saucers either, said, understood it to mean that whatever they were building had a reactor in it, and that if the reactor got hurt, so would we. And Evelyn Sutter sat in that workshop with her notebook open and thought about a 51-year-old woman standing on a farm-to-market road with her face turned up toward the sky, and understood for the first time that Betty Cash's injuries were not a mystery at all. They were a documented occupational hazard. Somebody had written a briefing about them. Betty Cash had simply not been on the distribution list. Price and Sutter met in a diner off the interstate to put it together, and what they built between them over the course of a long afternoon and a great deal of bad coffee was not a theory about aliens. It was a reconstruction of an accident. Start with the flame. Every account of the object describes intermittent fire beneath it, and every account describes the same rhythm. Fire, and the object rises. No fire, and the object sinks. Fire, again. Rise, again. Now, if you are a person who believes you are looking at a spacecraft, that rhythm reads as propulsion. The thing is flying. That is how it flies. Fine. But Price, who thought in terms of systems and failures, looked at that rhythm and saw something entirely different. He saw a machine that could not hold altitude. Consider what you're actually being told by the witnesses. An object hanging over a road at roughly treetop height, in a residential and agricultural area, near a major metropolitan airspace, discharging enormous quantities of energy downward in bursts in order to avoid descending further. Nothing operating normally does that. Normal flight is boring. Normal flight holds a heading and an altitude and gets where it is going. What Betty Cash watched was a machine fighting. Every burst of flame brought it altitude. and every pause spent at altitude and the margin between the two was not comfortable. Because if it had been comfortable, the machine would have been at 10,000 feet where nobody could see it, instead of at 200 feet over a public road where 3 civilians could stand underneath it and be cooked. That was the reconstruction. That was the whole thing, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The object was not hovering, it was crashing, slowly, in stages. And whatever system was producing that fire was not its engine at all, or not only its engine. Price's guess, and he was clear that it was a guess, was that they were watching an emergency function, a stabilization system, a last resort method of dumping energy downward in order to stay in the air, the aerospace equivalent of throwing everything overboard, running only in extremis, generating precisely the kind of radiant and ionizing output that a design team would have written a warning briefing about. And now look at the helicopters again, because the helicopters had never made sense as an escort. Escorts fly formation. Escorts have station-keeping positions. What the witnesses described was messier than that. Aircraft converging from multiple directions, arriving at different times, some circling, some moving ahead, some hanging back. That is not an escort. That is a response. That is what it looks like when a distributed set of aircraft is called in from wherever they happen to be and vectored toward a moving problem. They arrive piecemeal because they came from piecemeal locations. They do not fly a clean formation because they are not performing a ceremony. They are managing an emergency across a moving footprint. And what were they doing? Evelyn said it out loud first, in the diner, and Price said afterward that it was the moment the story stopped being interesting and started being frightening. They were not following it. They were shepherding it. The helicopters were doing the one thing that a formation of that size is uniquely capable of doing over populated terrain, which is controlling the ground. Not the sky. The ground. Keeping the space beneath a descending, radiating, unstable machine as empty of human beings as possible, while it made its way towards somewhere it could be put down without anyone seeing. Every road it crossed, somebody had to be prepared to hold. Every field it drifted over, somebody had to be watching. 20-plus aircraft is not an escort for an object. It is a moving quarantine, and it failed. That is the part that Price could not get past. For all the aircraft, for all the standby crews, for all the planning that had put fuel drums at a caretaker's airfield in the week after Christmas, the operation still put a crippled experimental vehicle directly over a farm-to-market road with a car on it. Because you cannot clear every road. Because the object was not going where anyone wanted it to go. Because it was falling, and falling things do not accept guidance. Betty Cash stopped her car directly beneath its flight path, and for something between 3 and 8 minutes, depending on which account you take, 3 American civilians stood closer to the most classified object in the country than anyone outside the program was ever intended to get. Now here is where Evelyn hit the wall, and it is a real wall, and it is the reason this story has a second half. If Nightfall was American, if the object was American, if the helicopters were American, then the government's behaviour afterward makes no sense. Think about it practically rather than dramatically. A government that has accidentally injured 3 civilians with a classified aircraft has a well-worn playbook available, and the playbook does not involve court. It involves a quiet visit from a man with a briefcase, an offer of medical care at a facility that does not ask questions, a payment characterised as something else entirely, and a non-disclosure agreement. This is not conspiracy theory. This is ordinary government risk management, and it has been done many times in documented cases involving contamination, testing, and industrial accidents. It is enormously cheaper than a lawsuit. It is enormously quieter. It generates almost no record. And crucially, it works, because the people involved are usually frightened and sick, and would rather have their medical bills paid than have a legal battle they cannot afford. So why did nobody visit Betty Cash? Why did the United States government, faced with a woman whose hair was falling out and who had every reason to keep talking, choose the loudest possible option, which is to say denial followed by 5 years of federal litigation? Evelyn Sutter turned that question over for months, and eventually she arrived at the only answer that fit, and it was the answer that took her from a story about an aircraft to a story about something else entirely. They did not settle because they could not. A settlement is an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement invites a question. And the question that Betty Cash's injuries raised was not what were you flying? It was what was in it. Compensation would have been trivially affordable. Discovery would not. Discovery means depositions. Discovery means a federal judge asking a technical witness, under oath, to describe the power source of the vehicle that burned the plaintiff, and there is no version of that sentence that any government on earth was going to permit to be spoken in an open courtroom in Houston. So they took the harder road. They said no, on the record, in every branch, and they let 3 sick people carry the cost of it, and they won, because the burden of proof was on the plaintiffs, and the plaintiffs did not have 20 helicopters worth of paperwork. Evelyn wrote in her notes that night a single line that she underlined twice. The denial is the evidence. Nobody spends 5 years in federal court to protect an aircraft. They spend 5 years in federal court to protect what the aircraft was made of. Dr. Elias Ketter was 81 years old when Evelyn Sutter found him, and he was living in a house in New Mexico with too many books in it, and a view of a mountain he said he had stopped looking at years ago. He had been a physicist. That is the whole of what his public record said. A degree, a decade at a national laboratory, and then 30 years of employment listed under the names of companies that turned out, when Evelyn traced them, to be addresses rather than businesses. Post office boxes with payrolls. She had expected to be turned away. Instead, he opened the door, looked at her for a while and said, "You are the one asking about the helicopters." Evelyn said she was. He said, "Come in. Everyone else asks about the object." Here is what Elias Ketter told her over 3 visits, and I will remind you one more time that Ketter is invented, that the program is invented, and that what makes this section worth listening to is not that it happened, but that every element of the environment surrounding it is documented and true. He started with money. He said that people who write about the Cold War always want to talk about missiles, and that missiles were the least interesting thing about it. Missiles were understood. The physics were settled by the late 1950s, and after that it was engineering and accounting. What kept people awake at the top of the American technical establishment was not the weapons they understood. It was the possibility of a weapon they did not. Ketter said that from roughly the middle of the 1950s onward, there was a persistent, structural, institutional fear inside the American research community that the Soviet Union might achieve a fundamental physical breakthrough first, not a better missile, a different kind of physics, something that would make the entire existing arsenal into scrap metal overnight, the way the machine gun made cavalry into a memory. And because nobody could rule that fear out, money flowed toward anything that might conceivably be a breakthrough. This part is real, and I want to underline it, because it is easy to hear it as fiction. The United States genuinely funded nuclear-powered aircraft. That is a documented program. Engineers spent years attempting to build a bomber that would fly on reactor heat, and prototype reactors were genuinely flown aboard aircraft to test shielding. There were serious government-funded investigations into exotic propulsion concepts, into electromagnetic effects, into plasma physics with applications nobody would name. The nuclear-powered aircraft effort alone consumed over $1 billion in period money before it was cancelled. That is the real world. That is not a theory. That is a line item. So when Ketter told Evelyn that the appetite for exotic propulsion never actually went away, that it merely went quiet and dispersed into smaller compartments after the public programs were cancelled, he was describing something that requires no imagination to believe. What he described next does. He said that one effort went further than the others. He said that a vehicle was constructed. Not a concept, not a paper study, an actual airframe built and flown, and that it did not derive its lift from conventional aerodynamics in the way that a wing derives lift. He was vague about the mechanism, and Evelyn pressed him, and he said, not evasively but almost apologetically, that he could not explain it to her because he had never fully been able to explain it to himself. What he could describe was behaviour. The vehicle produced enormous heat. It generated electromagnetic interference severe enough that ground equipment within a certain radius simply stopped working during operations, which imposed brutal constraints on where and when it could be flown. It could change direction in ways that would have destroyed a conventional aircraft and possibly its pilot, though Ketter would not confirm whether it was piloted, and when Evelyn asked directly, he changed the subject in a way she found more disturbing than a refusal. And it was unstable. That was the recurring word. Not dangerous, not experimental, not temperamental. Unstable. Ketter used it the way an engineer uses it, as a technical description of a system that does not naturally return to equilibrium after a disturbance. Something that has to be actively held in a safe state, and which will not stay there on its own. Its internal designation, he said, was Aurelia. Evelyn asked why. He said program names were drawn from lists and meant nothing, and then, after a pause, he said that the man who chose it had told him it was a genus of jellyfish. Something that moves without limbs, something transparent, so that when you look at it you can see the machinery inside. Ketter said he had always thought that was more honest than the man intended, and on the night of December 29th, 1980, Aurelia suffered a containment failure over the state of Texas. Ketter did not use dramatic language about it. He said containment failure the way a man says flat tire. He said that the specific mode did not matter to Evelyn's story, that it was an engineering event, and that engineering events of that kind had happened before on the ground, where they could be handled quietly. What made this one different was that it happened in flight, and it happened in the wrong place. He said the vehicle was capable of a controlled descent under emergency power, and that emergency power meant dumping energy, downward impulses, and that the crews, or the systems, or whatever was making decisions aboard that machine, had one objective from the moment the failure began. Do not come down where people are. The problem was that the failure occurred east of Houston, and east of Houston in 1980 was not empty. It was small towns, farm roads, subdivisions creeping outward, oil infrastructure, and a very great deal of highly flammable pine forest. There was no clean place to fall for 100 miles in the direction it was drifting, and it did not have 100 miles of altitude left. So nightfall was activated, and now every strange thing about that night resolves into something almost mundane. The helicopters came from multiple directions because they were pulled from wherever crews were sitting on standby. They arrived in waves because distance is distance. They flew low because they were managing the ground, not the air. They flew with the object rather than after it because their job was to move alongside a problem, not to chase it. And their orders were procedural and uninformative because the men flying them could not be told what they were shepherding in case one of them ended up in front of a microphone or in a hospital or in a courtroom. Ketter told Evelyn that the operation was, by the standards of what it was attempting, a success. The vehicle did not come down in a town. It did not come down in the forest. It did not scatter its power system across 4 counties of southeast Texas in the last week of December 1980. And it did not create an event that would have been impossible to explain to a nation that was already having a difficult year. It made it home. Evelyn asked what the cost had been, and Elias Ketter, 81 years old, in a house with too many books, said that he had been given a summary afterward, as everyone at his level was, and that the summary listed the operation as concluded with no injuries to program personnel. He said he had read that line many times over the years. Program personnel. He said that when he finally learned about Betty Cash, sometime in the mid-1980s, from a newspaper like everybody else, he had gone back and read that line again, and understood that it was not a lie. It was simply a very carefully bounded truth. There is a thing that people misunderstand about secrecy, and Evelyn Sutter came to believe that this misunderstanding is the reason cover-ups work. People imagine a room. They imagine that somewhere there is a room with a long table and a group of men who know the whole story, and that the entire apparatus of concealment radiates outward from that room. And because they imagine that room, They also imagined that if you could just get one person out of it, the truth would come out whole and intact, the way a document comes out of a filing cabinet. Real secrecy does not work like that, and it is much more effective than the room. Real secrecy works by division. Compartmentalization, as it is actually practiced, does not ask people to lie. It asks them to be honestly ignorant. You give each participant exactly the portion of the picture required to do their specific job, and you build the boundaries so that no ordinary person's ordinary curiosity ever bumps into the edges. The helicopter pilot knows he's flying a track at 400 feet and maintaining standoff from a designated object. He is not lying when he says he does not know what the object was. He genuinely does not know. Nobody told him. He was not supposed to be told, and if he had asked, the answer would have been that it was not his lane. The recovery team on the ground knows they are receiving a vehicle into a hangar and that certain protective procedures apply. They do not know who built it, and the man who did build it is 1,500 miles away and has never met them and could not tell you where the hangar is. The engineer who designed the containment system knows a great deal about physics and nothing whatsoever about helicopters. The clerk who processed the fuel requisition knows about fuel, and the officer who signed the tasking order signed something that said support recovery of sensitive aerospace material, which was true and which described nothing. Now watch what happens when a lawsuit arrives. Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum went to federal court and asked, in the plain language of ordinary people who have been hurt, whose helicopters were those, and the United States Army was asked whether it had operated an unidentified object over Huffman, Texas, on the night in question. The answer was no, because the Army had not operated the object. The object did not belong to the Army. The Army had at most provided airframes and crews under an operational control arrangement to a tasking whose ultimate customer was not the Army, and was never identified as such in any document an Army records officer would have been able to find. The Air Force was asked the same question. The Air Force had not operated the object either. The Navy had not. The Coast Guard had not. Nobody had lied. That is the elegance of it, and it is horrifying precisely because it requires no villain. Every individual response in that litigation could have been given truthfully by an honest person under oath, and the aggregate effect was that 3 injured civilians were told that nothing had happened to them. Evelyn wrote that the system did not conceal the truth. The system was shaped so that the truth had nowhere to accumulate, and that, she came to believe, was the actual function of Nightfall, not the recovery. Recovery was the visible part. The real product of Nightfall was deniability, engineered in advance, built into the org chart the way a crumple zone is built into a car. Borrow the aircraft, borrow the crews, never own anything. Task through intermediaries, ensure that when the question finally comes, as it eventually will, every entity that receives it can answer honestly in the negative, which brought her, at last, to the paperwork. Because for all of that architecture, Evelyn Sutter still believed the thing she had believed at the beginning. Machines leave paper. Compartmentalization can prevent anyone from assembling the picture, but it cannot prevent a Chinook from burning fuel, and it cannot prevent an airframe from accruing hours, and it cannot prevent a maintenance officer from needing to know exactly how long the aircraft has flown, so that he knows when to pull the transmission. Somewhere the flying had been recorded. She went back to Warren Kessick. He had, it turned out, kept things. Not classified material, he was firm about that, and Evelyn believed him. What he had kept were the ordinary administrative papers that accumulate around a career, the copies you end up with because you were a squadron commander and somebody handed you a stack. Flight summary sheets, monthly aircraft utilization reports, the dull statistical exhaust of an aviation unit. And in among them, for the last week of December 1980, from a unit he had once commanded and still had friends in, was a set of records that Evelyn Sutter looked at for a very long time. They were not redacted. That was the first surprise. There were no black bars, no stamps, no ominous markings. They looked like every other page in the stack. The aircraft were listed, tail numbers, several of them, tandem-rotor airframes. The date was listed, the 29th. The flight hours were listed. substantial ones, night hours, logged against each airframe, the kind of numbers that mean an aircraft was in the air for the better part of a shift. The fuel consumption was listed, and the numbers were consistent with the hours. The crews were listed by position, and they had been paid because the pay records had gone through the same system that pays everyone. The mission was listed as a training operation, and the destination field was empty, not blacked out, not marked classified, not withheld pending review, empty. The column was there, the header was there, the rows above and below it on other dates were filled in with the mundane names of the mundane places that helicopters go. For the 29th of December, 1980, the aircraft had flown for hours, burned thousands of pounds of fuel, put crews in the air overnight and gone nowhere. Evelyn asked Keswick whether that could be an oversight. She said she had to ask. Clerical errors happen. People forget to fill in fields. And Keswick, who had spent 22 years inside that bureaucracy, laughed for the first and only time in their acquaintance, and it was not a happy sound. He said that the army loses many things, but it does not lose a formation. He said that a missing destination on one aircraft on one night is a clerk having a bad day. A missing destination on every aircraft on a single specific night. With the hours and the fuel and the pay intact is not an omission. It is an edit. Somebody had gone through those records afterward deliberately and removed one specific piece of information while leaving everything else untouched. And they had left everything else untouched because removing the hours would have created an accounting discrepancy that a maintenance officer would notice, and removing the fuel would have created a discrepancy that a supply officer would notice, and removing the pay would have created a discrepancy that a soldier would notice, and soldiers notice pay. The only field they could safely empty was the one that nobody downstream needed, the destination. Which tells you, Keswick said, exactly one thing, and it is the only thing those records will ever tell you. Whoever cleaned that paperwork did not care that anyone would know the flight happened. They cared, very specifically, that nobody would ever know where it ended. The destination took Evelyn Sutter 4 more years to find, and she found it not through documents but through a man's shoulder. His name, and this remains invented, was Dale Rouvain, and he had worked construction and facilities maintenance on contract at a restricted site out along the eastern edge of Texas, near enough to the Louisiana line that the local accent had started to change. The site was not on any public list of installations. Officially it was a storage and support annex. Practically, according to Rouvain, it was 2 enormous hangars, a great deal of fence, a runway that was longer than a support annex has any business having, and a badge system with more tiers than there were people to fill them. He had been there for 6 years. He had cleared drains and repaired doors and repainted lines on concrete, and he had done it under the specific condition, common to that kind of work, that he never asked what any of it was for. Evelyn found him because of the shoulder. He had a permanent limitation in his right arm from a fall, and the fall had been documented in a workers' compensation claim, and workers' compensation claims are public in a way that classified facilities are not. The claim listed an employer, and the employer's address was a field with a mailbox, and Evelyn Sutter had spent 11 years learning that this is precisely what a real lead looks like. Not a whistleblower with a briefcase, a man with a bad shoulder and a paper trail he never knew he had made. He talked to her because his wife told him to. What he described about the night of December 29th, 1980, was, again, not dramatic. I keep saying that, and I keep saying it because it is the reason the story works. Real institutional events are experienced by the people inside them as inconvenience. Rouvain said that at around 7 in the evening, the site went to a condition he had seen only twice before in 6 years. All contract personnel were moved to the interior of the support building, not sent home, moved inside and kept there with the doors controlled. Somebody brought sandwiches, which he remembered because sandwiches meant it was going to be a while. He said the big hangar had been cleared that afternoon. Everything rolled out, everything covered, the floor swept. He said that from inside the support building he could not see the ramp, but he could hear it, and starting around 10 in the evening, he heard helicopters. Not one, not two. He said they came in over a period of about an hour, and that the sound never entirely stopped during that hour, and that anyone who has been near a busy military ramp knows what it means when the sound does not stop. He said the building's windows had been covered years before, which he had always thought was strange for a building where people ate lunch. And then, sometime after midnight, he said, everything went quiet. Not gradually, all at once. He said the helicopters stopped, and there was a stretch of silence, and then he felt something, which was his phrase, not heard, felt. A low pressure in the room, the kind of thing that makes the water move in a glass. He said the lights browned down briefly and came back. He said one of the men in the room with him, an electrician he had worked with for years, looked at the ceiling and then looked at the floor and said nothing at all. They were released at 4 a.m. Ravane went home and slept and came back the following day, and the hangar was closed, which was normal. The hangar was often closed. What was not normal was the following week. He was sent in to assess the floor. That is the detail that Evelyn Sutter said she thought about more than any other in the entire investigation, because it is so profoundly ordinary. Somebody needed the concrete looked at. Concrete is a facilities matter. Facilities matters go to contractors. And so a man with no clearance to know anything was walked into the hangar where the most classified object in the country was sitting, because the floor was damaged and floors are not classified. He said the first thing he noticed was the temperature. The hangar was warm, not from heaters. Warm the way a garage is warm in the evening after a hot day holding it. The second thing was the smell. He said it was ozone and hot metal and something underneath it he never identified. Faintly sweet, like a transformer that had been running too hard. The third thing was the floor. There was a region near the centre he estimated 30 feet across where the concrete had changed. Not cratered, not cracked. Scorched, discoloured, and in places the surface had spalled, popped off in flakes the way concrete does when moisture inside it turns to steam faster than it can escape. He had seen that before in fire damage. He had never seen it in a building that had not burned. There were technicians working, and they were wearing full protective equipment, and there were instruments on stands. And at the far end of the hangar, behind a temporary barrier of what he described as a heavy panels on rolling frames, there was something large under covers. He was not supposed to look at it. He looked at it. He said the covers did not fit it well, because the covers were designed for aircraft, and aircraft are long. This was not long. He said the shape underneath came to a point at the bottom, and widened, and came to a point again at the top, and that the whole thing stood taller than it was wide, and that there was no part of it he could identify as a wing, a rotor, a tail, an intake, or a cockpit. He said it looked like something you would find at the bottom of the ocean, and he said the lower portion, the part below the widest point, where the covers had been pulled back for the technicians to work, was black. Not painted black, burned, blistered and blackened, and in one place peeled, the way the skin of a spacecraft peels on re-entry. Evelyn asked him if he had told anyone. He said he had told his wife once, in 1981, and then not again for 20 years. She asked why, and Dale Ravane said that when he came out of that hangar, a man he had never seen before was waiting at the door with a clipboard and asked him to confirm his name and his contractor number, and wrote them down and thanked him. That was all. No threat, no warning, no paperwork to sign, just a man with a clipboard, writing his name down, on purpose, in front of him, so that he would see it happen. Ravane said it was the single most effective thing anyone has ever done to him in his life. He said, they did not have to tell me to keep quiet. They just had to make sure I knew that they knew who I was. By the time Evelyn Sutter had all of it, she believed she had finished. She had a program. She had a vehicle. She had a mechanism for the injuries and a reason for the helicopters, and a structural explanation for why every branch of the United States military had been able to answer no under oath without a single person committing perjury. She had a facility, a floor, and a shape under a tarpaulin. She had, in her own assessment, solved the Cash-Landrum incident. The answer was that Betty Cash had been burned by an American aircraft. It was terrestrial. It was ours. There was nothing from another world involved anywhere in it, and the great cosmic mystery of 1980 was, in the end, an industrial accident with a very expensive insurance problem. She drove out to New Mexico to tell Elias Ketter, because it seemed to her that after everything, he deserved to hear it laid out. She talked for perhaps 20 minutes. He let her finish. Then he said, "You have made one mistake." She asked what it was. He said, "You think we built it?" Evelyn said that he had told her they built it. He had described the airframe. He had described the containment system. He had described engineers. And Keter said, "Yes, we built the aircraft. We did not build the engine." And then he explained, in the flat, unhurried way of a very old man who has decided that a thing is going to be said, and that the saying of it is no longer a decision but a schedule, what Aurelia actually was. He said that years before, well before his own involvement, an assembly had come into the possession of the American intelligence establishment. He would not say from where, and Evelyn came to believe that this was not because he was refusing, but because he genuinely had never been told. He said that this assembly was a propulsion unit, or was understood to function as one, and that nobody had ever been able to determine who manufactured it, not which country, who. He said that the initial assumption, held for years and defended vigorously, was that it was Soviet, and that this assumption was the entire reason the program received the funding it did, because a Soviet propulsion breakthrough was the specific nightmare that the American technical establishment had organised itself around preventing. He said teams worked on that basis for a long time. He said the assumption did not survive metallurgy. Materials analysis, he told her, is not a mystical art. It is arithmetic. You determine what something is made of and how it was formed, and from those two facts you can generally reconstruct the industrial process that produced it, because manufacturing leaves fingerprints. Casting leaves fingerprints. Machining leaves fingerprints. Welds and joints and tool marks are a signature, and every nation's industry writes in its own hand. The assembly had no seams. It had no welds, no fasteners, no joints, no evidence of assembly of any kind. It was not put together. It was, as far as anyone could determine, one continuous object, and there was no known process in 1960 or 1970 or 1980 by which an object of that size and internal complexity could be produced as a single piece. He said the working conclusion, eventually, was not that the Soviets had achieved something, it was that nobody on Earth had. And so, over a period of years, American engineers did the only thing that American engineers have ever done with a piece of hardware they cannot manufacture and cannot fully understand. They built a machine around it. That, Ketter said, is what Aurelia was. Not a spacecraft. Not a reverse-engineered flying saucer of the kind that people write books about. It was a test platform. It was an aircraft, designed and constructed by human beings using human materials and human tolerances and human safety margins, wrapped around a power and propulsion assembly that no human being had ever fully characterized. They knew what it did. They had learned, empirically, over years, how to make it do it. They did not know how it worked. And when Evelyn asked the obvious question, the one that hung in that room in New Mexico like a smell, Ketter answered it before she finished asking. She said, "Then how did you know how to shut it down?" And he said, "We did not." That is what happened over Texas. The failure on the night of December 29th, 1980, was not a mechanical failure of American engineering. The American engineering held, the airframe held, the hydraulics held, the structure held all the way to the ground. What failed was the part nobody understood, and because nobody understood it, nobody could stop it. All the crew could do, all anyone could do, was pulse it downward and ride it down and pray that the men in the helicopters could keep the ground clear underneath them. Aurelia was not a machine that was flown. It was a machine that was survived. Evelyn asked whether the government's real fear, then, the thing that made a settlement impossible, was not the vehicle at all. Ketter said, "Correct." He said, "If we had paid that woman, a court would eventually have asked what burned her, and the honest answer, the only answer any of us could have given under oath, was that we did not know." He said, Imagine that in a transcript. Imagine the United States government stating in a federal courtroom in 1985 that it possessed an object of unknown origin, that it had been flying it over the continental United States, that it did not understand its power source, and that this power source had injured a civilian on a public road because it could not be controlled. He said, "We could survive being called liars. We could not survive being called reckless." There was a long silence, and then Elias Ketter said the sentence that Evelyn Sutter put at the front of everything she ever wrote about this case, and which I will give you now, because it is the whole of it. He said, "We did not build the machine. We built something around it." The envelope arrived years later. Evelyn Sutter had by then largely stopped. Not given up exactly. She had simply arrived at the place that every long investigation eventually arrives at, where you have gathered everything that can be gathered, and the remaining distance cannot be crossed by effort, only by luck. There was no return address. The postmark was from a city she had no connection to. Inside was a single photograph and nothing else. No letter, no note, no explanation. It was a print, not a copy. Slightly overexposed, the way flash photographs in large dark spaces always are, with the light falling off hard toward the edges so that the far end of the room dissolved into nothing. It showed the interior of a hangar. In the foreground, 3 technicians in full protective suits, hoods up, standing near an instrument cart. Behind them, a barrier of heavy panels on rolling frames, and behind the barrier, angled slightly away from the camera, was the object. It was exactly what 3 people had described from a farm-to-market road on the night of December 29th, 1980. A tall diamond. 2 cones joined at the base, wider at the middle than at either end, standing on a cradle that had been built to hold something that had clearly not been designed to sit on the ground. The lower third of it was destroyed, blackened, blistered. The surface curled and lifted in places like paper that has been held too near a flame. Directly beneath it, the concrete showed a broad discoloured region, and around that region, chalk marks and small numbered placards of the kind that engineers put down when they are documenting damage. Behind all of it, ranked along the back wall in the dim part of the frame, were helicopters, large ones. The unmistakable double-humped silhouette of tandem-rotors, at least 4 of them, parked with their blades folded, and along the bottom edge of the print, written in pen in a small careful hand, was a line. Nightfall. December the 30th, 1980, the day after. Evelyn looked at that photograph for a long time, and what she noticed first was, predictably, everything I have just described. The shape, the damage, the helicopters, the date. It was confirmation of every single thing that a decade of work had assembled, and she said afterward that her first emotion was not triumph, but a kind of dull, sinking tiredness, because she understood immediately that she could never publish it. An anonymous photograph with no provenance is not evidence. It is an anecdote with a picture attached. It was the second thing she noticed that she never got over. Where the outer surface had burned away on the lower portion of the vehicle, it had not burned through. It had peeled, and underneath it was another layer. You can see it clearly in the photograph, she said, if you know to look. The outer skin is what you would expect. Panels, seams, fastener rows, the visible grammar of aerospace manufacturing, the same grammar you would find on any aircraft in any hangar in the world, because human beings build things out of pieces and then join the pieces together, and we have been doing it that way since we made the first boat. Beneath it, where the panels had lifted, the surface was continuous. No seams, no fasteners, no panel lines, no weld beads, nothing that indicated a joint anywhere, curving away smoothly into the shadow at the edge of the flash, catching the light in a way that made it look less like metal than like water that had been stopped. 2 layers. The outer one was ours. And in that hangar photograph, sitting in a woman's kitchen in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, was the answer to the entire question, and it was not the answer anyone had been looking for. So let me tell you what the conspiracy actually is in this story, and then I am going to let you go to sleep. It is not that Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum and a 7-year-old boy named Colby met beings from another world on a Texas road in the last week of 1980. That is the version people want, because that version is, in a strange way, comforting. It puts the strangeness outside of us. It makes us the small ones, the visited ones, the ones who cannot be blamed. The version in this story is worse. In this story, there was nobody from anywhere else aboard that machine. There was nothing to make contact with. Whatever had come, if it had ever come at all, had come and gone long before, and had left behind a piece of hardware in somebody's warehouse, and the actual event over Huffman, Texas was purely and entirely human. It was human beings, in a human aircraft, flying human missions, with a human chain of command and a human budget and a human procurement process, operating an engine that no human being on Earth understood. And when it broke, human beings could not fix it, because you cannot repair what you cannot read. Betty Cash was not injured by an alien. She was injured by our own impatience, by the entirely ordinary, entirely recognisable human decision to fly the thing before we understood the thing, because the Soviets might be flying one too, and because waiting felt more dangerous than not waiting. She stood on a public road on a cold December night and looked up, and what looked back at her was the gap between our ambition and our comprehension, and it was radiating, and it did not know she was there. And the cover-up that followed was not about hiding visitors. It was about hiding the fact that we had taken something we did not understand, built a machine around it, put it in the sky over a country full of sleeping people, and lost control of it. That is the whole conspiracy. That is all of it. Not that they are here, that they were here once, and left something behind, and that we picked it up, and that we could not put it down. Before we get into tonight's story, a quick thank you to Rob. This one was his idea, and honestly it is one of the strangest rabbit holes we have ever gone down. Now, let's begin. Picture the American Midwest, somewhere rural, a summer night in 1995, the kind where the air sits thick and still, and the only thing moving is the hum of electrical lines strung between wooden poles on the edge of someone's property. Inside a house, not a laboratory, not a university, not a government facility. A man is alone with a machine he built himself. He is not a scientist with credentials. He is not a physics professor with published papers. He is an amateur, a tinkerer, someone who looked at the rules of the universe and asked a question most people would never dare to ask out loud. And on this particular night, he is about to call a radio show and tell millions of listeners what he thinks he has found. His name is Mike Markham. and what he describes in the hours and years that follow is either the most elaborate late-night radio hoax in American history, or something far, far more disturbing. He didn't sound like he was guessing. He sounded like someone describing something he had already seen. This is the story of a man who claimed he bent time in his garage, who vanished, who returned, and who left behind a silence that researchers and theorists are still trying to explain decades later. Welcome to Sleep Theories. Turn the lights down low. This one is going to stay with you. Part 1. The Device. July 1995. Coast to Coast AM is not a normal radio program. It never has been. Launched in 1988 and hosted in its classic era by the calm, measured voice of Art Bell, the show specialises in the edges of human knowledge, UFO encounters, government cover-ups, paranormal phenomena, ancient mysteries, the topics that mainstream media will not touch. Art Bell has a gift. He is not a sensationalist. He does not mock his callers or perform disbelief for entertainment. He listens. He asks follow-up questions. He gives people space to explain themselves. And that quality, that genuine patient attention, is what makes what happens on this particular night so remarkable. Because when Mike Markham calls in, Art Bell listens. And so does an audience of millions spread across North America, tuned in late at night through crackling AM frequencies and the peculiar intimacy of radio. Markham does not stumble into his explanation. He does not sound nervous. He speaks with the measured, deliberate cadence of someone who has rehearsed, not because he is performing, but because he has been thinking about this for a very long time and wants to get the details exactly right. He describes a device he has constructed over a period of months, not purchased, not borrowed, built by hand from components he sourced himself. At its core, the device involves 6 large electrical transformers arranged in a circular configuration. The precise geometry of the arrangement, he suggests, is important, not arbitrary. The positioning creates a specific kind of field, an electromagnetic environment that, when powered at sufficient levels, produces something unexpected. The power requirements are enormous. We are not talking about a lamp or a household appliance. Markham describes drawing massive electrical input, the kind of draw that would register on a utility company's monitoring equipment, the kind of draw that lights up a neighbourhood's grid and trips breakers if the infrastructure is not adequate. He powers it up, and something happens. Inside the electromagnetic field generated by the circular transformer array, Markham says he observes a distortion, not a visual trick, not a lens flare or a camera artifact, something physical. A region within the field where light and space seem to behave incorrectly, where the air itself appears to shimmer in a way that does not correspond to heat or wind or any conventional explanation. He describes it carefully. A pocket, a zone, a place where the normal rules seem suspended, and then he describes the test. He takes a metal screw, small, ordinary, the kind you might find in any hardware store, and he drops it into the field. It does not fall, it does not bounce, it does not roll, it does not spin, it vanishes. Markham pauses when he describes this moment, not for dramatic effect, more like the pause of someone who is still, even months later, processing what they witnessed. The screw went in. The screw did not come out. There was no sound, no flash, no heat signature, just absence. Art Bell asks the obvious question, where did it go? And Markham says simply, he does not know, but he has a theory. Part 2, the theory of displacement. To understand what Markham is suggesting, and why it is not as absurd as it might first sound, it helps to understand a little about how physicists actually think about time. In standard Newtonian physics, time is a backdrop, a fixed stage on which events occur. It does not bend, it does not stretch, it does not pool or eddy. It simply passes, uniformly, everywhere. Einstein changed that, permanently. His theory of special relativity, published in 1905, demonstrated mathematically, and later experimentally, that time is not fixed. It is relative. It depends on the observer's velocity and, crucially, on the gravitational and electromagnetic environment surrounding the observer. Time passes more slowly in stronger gravitational fields. Time passes more slowly for objects moving at higher velocities. These are not philosophical abstractions. They are measurable facts. The GPS satellites orbiting Earth right now require constant relativistic corrections, or they would drift out of sync within hours. General relativity takes this further. Space-time, the unified fabric of space and time, can be curved, warped and distorted by mass and energy. The more extreme the concentration of mass or energy, the more dramatic the distortion. Theoretical physicists have spent decades exploring the implications of these equations. Among the more serious ideas to emerge is the concept of closed time-like curves, mathematical paths through space-time that loop back on themselves. If such paths exist in the real universe, they would represent a mechanism by which time travel, or at minimum temporal displacement, might be physically possible. Separately, there has been significant theoretical interest in what happens to space-time geometry under extreme electromagnetic conditions. Certain configurations of rotating electromagnetic fields, particularly in the presence of high-density energy and specific geometric arrangements, produce mathematical descriptions that begin to resemble the conditions near theoretical wormholes and temporal anomalies. None of this proves that Mike Markham built a time machine in his garage in rural Missouri, but it does mean that the framework he is gesturing toward, electromagnetic fields as a mechanism for temporal distortion, is not pure fantasy. It is adjacent to real physics. Distant from mainstream science, yes, but not entirely disconnected from it. Markham, it seems, had done his homework, or stumbled into something that no amount of homework could have prepared him for. Part 3. The Dog. The follow-up call comes sometime after the first. Markham returns to Coast AM with an update. He has conducted a second experiment. This time, not with a screw. He used a small dog. The specifics are sparse. Markham does not offer the animal's breed, its age, or whose dog it was. He describes the preparation in broad strokes. The device powered up, the field established, the same distortion visible within the electromagnetic pocket. And then, the dog was introduced to the field. It disappeared. Markham says he waited. He does not specify how long, but he waited, and the dog came back, alive, physically intact as far as he could tell. No visible injuries, no burns, no signs of trauma in the conventional sense, but disoriented, profoundly disoriented. The animal's behaviour after its return was altered, not in ways that Markham could definitively categorise, but in ways that seemed beyond a simple fright response. The dog did not seem injured. It seemed, in some fundamental way, confused about where, or perhaps when, it was. Now. Here is where the listener has a choice. You can hear this detail and dismiss it. It sounds preposterous. It sounds like exactly the kind of embellishment a caller would add to make a story more compelling. A disappeared screw is easy to fake. A disappeared dog is a story. A disappeared dog that comes back is something else entirely. But consider for a moment the alternative interpretation. Consider the possibility that Markham is not embellishing, that he is instead documenting, that the animal returned with behavioural changes because it experienced something temporal, spatial, electromagnetic, that a dog has no framework to process and no language to communicate, that the disorientation was not from fear but from dislocation. There is a concept in trauma research called temporal confusion, a state in which the brain loses its grasp on chronological sequence following extreme stress or neurological disruption. Human patients who undergo certain kinds of seizures, strokes, or profound psychological shocks describe something similar, a sense that time itself has become unstable, that the present moment does not feel continuous with the moments before it. If what Markham's device generated was a genuine temporal field, even a brief localized one, then the dog's disorientation might not be a symptom of fear. It might be the only honest response to having been, however briefly, somewhere else in time. Markham reports these findings to Art Bell with the same measured calm he brought to the first call. He is not excited exactly. He is focused. He has a result and he is reporting it accurately, without interpretation, the way a researcher would. Art Bell asks what he plans to do next. Markham says he plans to scale up. Part 4, The Warning Signs. At some point between his early calls and the call that would change everything, something shifts. Markham contacts Art Bell with a different kind of update. Not a technical progress report. Something more personal, more urgent. He believes he's being watched. The details he describes are individually explainable. Taken together, they form a pattern that unsettles him. He reports unexplained power outages, not just on his property, but in a radius around it. He reports strangers in the area, people asking questions of his neighbours about who he is and what he does. He reports increased attention from official-seeming people whose reasons for being in his neighbourhood are not clear. None of this is verifiable. Art Bell notes it carefully but does not press. This is, after all, exactly the kind of detail that paranoid callers add to their stories to explain why they have no evidence and why no one can confirm their claims. But it is also exactly the kind of detail that would appear in a genuine account of unsanctioned experimentation that had attracted official attention. Consider what Markham describes having done. He has drawn significant, unusual amounts of electrical power over an extended period. He has, on at least one occasion, caused something to disappear. Whether that something went somewhere or nowhere, the disappearance itself is an event that produces a physical signature. Electromagnetic anomalies of sufficient magnitude are detectable, not by a neighbour with a cell phone, but by monitoring infrastructure built specifically to detect unusual energy events. The United States government has operated electromagnetic monitoring programs for decades. Some are classified, some are openly described in defence research literature. The exact capabilities of such systems are not publicly known, but it is not a conspiratorial fantasy to suggest they exist. They do. The more interesting question is what they do with what they find. Markham's description of the surveillance period does not have the flavour of paranoia. It does not escalate into wild claims about helicopters or men in black. It is restrained and specific. He describes things that could be explained innocuously, but which, taken together, do not feel innocent to him. Then he stops calling. No announcement, no final transmission, no explanation. Just silence. Weeks pass, then months. And Art Bell's listeners wonder, quietly, in forums and late-night conversations and the analogue predecessor to comment sections, what happened to the man from the Midwest with the electromagnetic device and the vanishing screw. Part 5, The Return, 19. 97, 2 years later. The voice that calls into Coast to Coast AM in 1997 is recognisable. Art Bell knows it. Long-time listeners know it. The cadence is the same. The measured, careful pace is the same. The willingness to describe things precisely without embellishment is the same, but something is different. Not in tone exactly, not in manner, something harder to define. The voice sounds older, not just by 2 years. Anyone's voice changes slightly in 2 years. This is different. This is the quality of age that comes not from the accumulation of calendar time, but from the accumulation of experience. From having been somewhere that changed you in ways you cannot fully articulate. Markham explains what happened. After his last contact with the show, he had continued working on the device. Not in secret from the public. He had always been private about his work, but in secret from whatever attention he felt gathering around him. He rebuilt and scaled up the transformer array. He increased the power input. He modified the circular geometry based on observations from his earlier experiments. He wanted to create a sustained field. Not a brief distortion, but something stable enough to step into and examine at close range. He got what he wanted, and then something went wrong. Or, depending on how you interpret what followed, something went exactly as it should have, and the results were simply more extreme than he anticipated. He did not intend to enter the field himself, but the field at some point during activation expanded, or shifted, or, and this is Markham's phrasing, not an embellishment, reached out, and he was pulled through. Part 6. The Other Side of the Field. What follows in Markham's account is the part that listeners find most difficult to evaluate, not because it sounds impossible. By this point in the conversation, The audience has accepted that something unusual is being described, but because it sounds so specific, he describes waking up. Not a dream, not a hallucination. Waking up in a physical space with physical sensations, ground underfoot, air in his lungs, light from some source above him. Oriented in the basic sense of knowing up from down, left from right. Disoriented in every other sense. The environment is unfamiliar, not in the way that a foreign city is unfamiliar. The layout wrong, the language strange, unfamiliar in a more foundational way. He cannot immediately identify what is wrong, but something is. The technology he encounters is different. Not dramatically, science fiction different. Not flying cars and robot servants, more subtly different. Subtle enough that he questions his own perception. Are these things different, or is he misremembering what they looked like before? The question, he admits, haunts him. People he encounters do not respond to him normally, not hostilely, not with fear, more with the particular confusion of interacting with someone who seems slightly out of step with their context, who asks questions that seem odd, who expects things that are not quite right. He does not know precisely how far he has travelled. He has theories based on the observable differences, but he keeps them to himself for reasons that become clear later in the conversation. What he will say is this: he was not days away from his own time. He was not months away. He was years away. And he spent months, real months, lived months, months he felt in his body and his mind, trying to understand where he was, how far he had come, and how he might get back. Part 7. The Return Journey. The problem of returning is, in some ways, simpler than the problem of having left. Markham knows what his device does. He knows the basic principles. He knows the approximate geometry and the approximate power requirements. He does not have access to 6 large commercial transformers in an unfamiliar time, but he is resourceful. He describes a period of acquisition, finding components, improvising replacements, adapting the original design to available materials. The process takes months. He does not elaborate on how he acquires what he needs, or how he funds the project, or where he works on it. There are gaps in the narrative, deliberate gaps, one-senses, where Markham chooses not to be specific. What he does describe is the moment when the rebuilt device, smaller, cruder, less precise than the original, produces the familiar shimmer, the familiar distortion in the air, the familiar sense that the pocket within the field is somewhere that physics does not apply in its usual way. He steps in deliberately this time, and he comes back. The re-entry is disorienting in a way that is difficult to describe, he says. Not painful, not frightening exactly. More like the sensation of a dream that you feel certain you can remember. Rich, vivid, absolutely real, dissolving as you open your eyes. Not the content of the dream, the quality of it, the sense of a parallel solidity fading back into ordinary existence. He is in his garage, or what was his garage, in his own time, or approximately his own time, approximately. And that word, that one careful qualifier, is where the story becomes truly strange. Part 8. The Differences. Markham says it clearly and without drama. He does not believe he came back to exactly the same timeline he left. Not a different world. Not an alternate universe in the dramatic science fiction sense. Nothing so obvious. Nothing that would make a casual observer pause. He is in the same house, the same street, the same country, the same approximate era. By all visible measures, he is home, but there are differences. Small ones. The kind that you would only notice if you had a very precise memory of the original, which Markham does, because he spent months in an unfamiliar time holding on to the details of home as a kind of anchor. He memorized things, not because he expected to need to verify them, but because they were what he had. The details of where he came from were, in the absence of anything familiar, the closest thing he had to comfort. When he returns, some of those details do not match. He is careful not to be specific on air. He does not name the events or the people or the facts that are different. He says only that there are discrepancies, small ones, the kind that could theoretically be explained by a lapse of memory if you were willing to accept that explanation. He is not willing. He knows what he remembered, he knows what he finds, and they are not the same. He uses a phrase that Art Bell does not push him on, but that listeners return to again and again in the years that follow. It wasn't the same place I left. 6 words, delivered quietly, without self-pity or alarm, as a statement of fact from a man who has had a great deal of time to come to terms with what it means. The concept he is gesturing toward, returning from time travel to a slightly different version of the timeline you departed from, is not new to theoretical physics. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, developed by Hugh Everett in 1957, suggests that quantum events branch reality into diverging paths. The branches are typically imperceptible from within any single branch, but they are distinct, different. Each one is a genuine reality, equally valid, equally complete. If Markham's device genuinely displaced him through time, and if the quantum mechanics of such displacement involve branching, as some theoretical frameworks predict, then what he describes is entirely consistent with the physics. He did not return to his timeline, he returned to a timeline, similar enough to pass casual inspection, different enough that he knows, and there is no mechanism for going back. Once you are in a branch, you are in it. The branch you came from did not pause while you were gone. It continued. It is still continuing, somewhere in a superposition of possibilities that you can no longer access. Markham does not say any of this explicitly. He does not frame it in the language of quantum mechanics. He says only what he observed, what he felt, what he knows to be true despite having no way to prove it, and then he stops calling. Part 9. The Conspiracy. In the years that follow Markham's final appearance on Coast to Coast AM, a theory develops. Not among fringe groups who accept every strange story without scrutiny. Among people who have listened carefully to all of his calls, the early ones, the middle ones, the final return, and find something in the texture of his account that resists the simple explanation of hoax. Hoaxes tend to escalate. They tend toward drama. They tend to produce details that are designed to impress rather than details that are merely accurate. Markham's account does the opposite. It contracts around the things he is most certain of and expands only where he is uncertain, and he marks his uncertainty explicitly. He says things like, "I don't know exactly. I'm not sure. I can't be certain." These are not the phrases of a man performing a story. These are the phrases of a man trying to be honest about the limits of his knowledge. The conspiracy theory that emerges is not that Markham lied, it is that he told the truth, and that what he described, a localized electromagnetic anomaly capable of producing temporal distortion, is precisely the kind of thing that certain programs within the American defense and intelligence establishment would have a very strong interest in containing. The monitoring of electromagnetic anomalies is not speculative. The Department of Defense operates numerous programs dedicated to detecting unusual energy signatures across the continental United States. Some of these programs are openly described in defense research literature. Others are not. The exact capabilities of classified monitoring infrastructure are unknown, but the basic fact of its existence is not in dispute. If Markham's device generated a genuine electromagnetic event, one powerful enough to produce measurable distortions, it would have been detectable. The question is not whether it would have been noticed. The question is what would have happened next. The theory holds that what happened next was contact, not the kind involving handcuffs and public charges, the quieter kind, the kind that involves a conversation about the importance of discretion, about what someone has and what it would mean if the wrong people had access to it, about the various ways that continued public discussion of sensitive discoveries tends to complicate lives in ways that are difficult to recover from. No threats, no violence, just a clear communication about consequences, and Markham, the theory suggests, understood. He withdrew, he stopped calling. He disappeared from public discussion not because he was arrested or harmed or killed, but because he made a rational calculation and decided that the cost of continuing was higher than he was willing to pay. There is no evidence for this. There is also no evidence against it. What there is absence. Markham never surfaced again in any verifiable way. No interviews, no written accounts, no verified follow-up contact. For a man who twice called one of the most listened-to radio programs in North America to describe experiments he'd been conducting, the total subsequent silence is striking. People who tell hoax stories as a rule do not simply stop. The attention is the point. They find new audiences, new platforms, new iterations of their story. They do not go quietly and completely dark. Markham did. Part 10. What the recordings tell us. The calls to Coast AM were recorded. They still exist. They're archived in multiple places, accessible to anyone who wants to listen. People have done more than listen. Over the decades since the original broadcasts, engineers and researchers and curious obsessives have analysed the recordings, not for obvious signs of deception, the manipulation of emotion, the inconsistency of detail, the tells that experienced fraud examiners look for. What they listen for is something more specific to Markham's particular kind of claim: technical accuracy. Markham's descriptions of his device, the transformer configuration, the electromagnetic geometry, the power requirements, the nature of the observed effects, are consistent with real physics in ways that are genuinely difficult to fake convincingly. This is not because they describe a working time machine. They do not contain sufficient detail to replicate. It is because the things he says that can be checked against physics are correct. The principles he invokes are real. The behaviour he describes the field exhibiting is, under certain theoretical frameworks, plausible. This does not prove the machine worked. It does suggest that Markham either had a serious working knowledge of electromagnetic physics, which is possible if unusual for an amateur, or that he had actually been observing real phenomena and was describing what he saw rather than what he invented. There is also the question of what he does not describe. A skilled fabricator constructing a compelling false account tends to overspecify. They fill the gaps with invented detail because invented detail feels convincing. Markham's account has notable gaps. He does not know exactly where he went. He does not know exactly how far. He cannot explain the mechanism by which his improvised return device worked well enough to actually produce a return. He says multiple times in multiple ways, "I don't fully understand why it worked." That is not the language of a storyteller. That is the language of a practitioner, someone who has results he cannot fully account for. Someone who is honest about the gap between what he knows and what he suspects. Whether that makes him a time traveller or simply a very careful liar is a question that cannot at this remove be definitively answered. But the recordings sit there, preserved in the archives, waiting for someone to finally ask the question that resolves everything. No one has yet. Part 11. The Physics of the Impossible. Let's stay with the science for a moment. Not because we're going to resolve it, but because the degree to which Markham's story intersects with legitimate theoretical physics is more significant than most people realise. The central mechanism Markham describes, high-intensity electromagnetic fields producing spatial and temporal distortions, is not a concept he invented. There is a serious body of theoretical work exploring the relationship between electromagnetic fields and space-time geometry. It sits at the intersection of classical electrodynamics and general relativity, and while it remains largely theoretical, rather than experimental, it is not fringe science. It is the kind of science that appears in peer-reviewed journals and is discussed at academic conferences, carefully hedged and heavily qualified, but present nonetheless. One particularly relevant area of research concerns what physicists call frame dragging, the phenomenon, predicted by general relativity and confirmed by experiment, by which a massive rotating body literally drags the fabric of space-time around with it. The effect is subtle in ordinary circumstances. Around a sufficiently massive and rapidly rotating object, a neutron star or a rotating black hole, it becomes extreme. Space-time does not merely bend around such objects, it twists, it drools, it forms structures that, in the mathematics, begin to resemble closed time-like curves. The extension of this thinking to electromagnetic systems, replacing rotating mass with rotating electromagnetic fields as the driver of space-time distortion, is a step that some physicists have taken seriously, though quietly. The mathematics become complicated very quickly, and the energy requirements implied by even the most optimistic theoretical frameworks are staggering. But the idea that there is some relationship to be found between electromagnetic geometry and temporal structure is not a product of science fiction. It is a live theoretical question. Markham's device, as he describes it, would not have come anywhere near the energy densities required by mainstream theoretical frameworks. Not even close. The power he describes drawing is large by household standards and negligible by astrophysical ones. But here is the thing that the conspiracy-minded listener returns to again and again. What if the energy requirements of the mainstream theoretical frameworks are wrong because the mainstream theoretical frameworks are incomplete? What if there is some coupling between electromagnetic geometry and space-time that the standard model does not account for? What if Markham stumbled onto something real not because he understood the physics better than professional physicists, but because he was doing something, some precise combination of geometry and frequency and intensity that happened to hit a resonance that the theoretical frameworks do not predict because they have not been looking for it? Science is full of discoveries made accidentally by people who were looking for something else, or by people who were not formally trained and therefore were not constrained by the assumption that certain things are impossible. The establishment of a thing as impossible has often preceded its achievement by a remarkably short interval in the history of human innovation. We are not arguing that Markham built a time machine. We are arguing that the dismissal of his account, because time travel is impossible, and therefore he must be lying, is not as scientifically sound as it sounds. Impossibility is a strong claim. It demands strong evidence. The evidence that what Markham describes is physically impossible is, at this point, theoretical. And theoretical impossibility has a complicated history. Part 12. The silence has a shape. One of the most telling things about the Markham case, if we can call it a case, is the nature of the absence that follows his final broadcast appearance. Think about what the internet does to stories like this. Think about how the information ecosystem works in the era of archives and search engines and the relentless human appetite for resolution. When someone makes a dramatic claim and then disappears, the natural outcome in the modern world is that people go looking for them. They search records, they file freedom of information requests, they contact local newspapers, they drive to the address and knock on the door. They find the people who knew them and ask questions. This has happened with Markham's case. People have looked. Researchers with genuine investigative skills and genuine access to information-finding tools have spent real time trying to locate Mike Markham, to confirm his existence, to verify his location, to determine what became of him after his final call. They have found nothing definitive, not proof that he died, not proof that he moved abroad, not proof that he changed his name or withdrew to some remote location of his own choosing, not a confirmed photograph, not a verified address, not a social security death record, not a driver's license renewal, not the digital shadow that ordinary people leave simply by existing in a modern society. Just absence. Now, there are mundane explanations for this. Some people are genuinely difficult to find. Some people work deliberately to minimize their digital presence. Some people live in ways that leave fewer records than others. The absence of a digital footprint is not proof of anything except the absence of a digital footprint. But consider the constellation of absences. A man makes nationally broadcast claims about experiments he has conducted. He is contactable. He calls in, which means he can receive calls. He disappears from public view. He returns 2 years later with an extraordinary account. He makes that account public, with names and details and enough specificity to potentially verify. And then he vanishes again, this time permanently, without leaving any trace that can be confirmed despite decades of subsequent searching. Each individual absence is explainable. The pattern of absences is harder to explain away. And the theory that what happened to Mike Markham was not disappearance but removal, not abandonment but arrangement, lives in that pattern. Not in any single fact, in the shape of all the missing facts together. Part 13. What it means. If any of it is true, let's do something uncomfortable. Let's take the story seriously for a moment. Not uncritically, but seriously. Let's ask what it would mean if a fraction, of what Mike Markham described is accurate, if his device produced genuine temporal distortion of any kind, even brief, even localized, even on the scale of microseconds rather than years, then what he built represents something profound. Not just a scientific discovery, a proof of concept, evidence that temporal displacement is possible at energy scales, accessible to amateurs working in residential settings with commercially available components. That is not a minor thing. That is not a curiosity. That is a paradigm collapse. The implications would cascade immediately and irreversibly. If a man in rural Missouri can build a machine that distorts time, then the question of who else has built one, with better resources, better understanding, better geometry, better materials, becomes urgent. If the effect is real and scalable, then the question of who controls access to temporal displacement technology is not a philosophical question. It is a strategic one, a military one, an existential one. Governments have gone to extraordinary lengths to suppress or control technologies with far less dramatic implications than this. The history of classified research into unconventional physics, documented, partially declassified, and publicly accessible in fragments, suggests that there is significant institutional interest in the areas of research that border on what Markham describes. Programs like Stargate and MKultra and dozens of others whose names we do not know represent an institutional willingness to spend enormous resources on the apparently impossible when the payoff, if it exists, justifies the investment. In this context, the question is not whether the government would have been interested in Markham's work if it was real. Obviously they would. The question is what form that interest would take, and whether what looks, from the outside, like a man who simply stopped calling into a radio show might look very different from the inside. We cannot know. We're working from recordings of radio broadcasts in the absence of subsequent evidence. The story is, at its foundation, unverifiable. It lives in the space between the possible and the provable, which is exactly where the most interesting things in human experience tend to live. Part 14, The History of the Impossible Machine. To understand why Mike Markham's story captured the imagination of so many people, and why it has refused to fade in the decades since, it helps to understand that he was not operating in a vacuum. He was one voice in a long, strange lineage of amateur experimenters who claimed to have discovered properties of electromagnetism that mainstream science had overlooked, dismissed, or suppressed. The history of fringe physics is not entirely a history of delusion. It is also a history of premature dismissal. Some of the most important discoveries in the history of electricity were made by people without formal credentials working in conditions that the established institutions of their time would have found laughable. Michael Faraday, arguably the greatest experimental physicist of the 19th century, had no university education. He began his career as a bookbinder's apprentice and taught himself chemistry by reading the books he was paid to bind. The Royal Institution initially regarded him with the particular condescension that institutions reserve for people who presume to participate without permission. He persisted. He discovered electromagnetic induction. He changed everything. This is not to suggest that every garage experimenter is a Faraday in waiting. The vast majority of unconventional physics claims are wrong. Not suppressed, just wrong. The history of fringe science includes an enormous amount of self-deception, wishful thinking, and the particular cognitive bias by which people who have invested significant effort in a project become unable to evaluate its results objectively. But the history of fringe science also includes repeatedly the phenomenon of the correct intuition that arrives before the theoretical framework to support it. Tesla described wireless energy transmission decades before the physics of electromagnetic wave propagation was fully understood. Certain researchers working on what they called etheric phenomena in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were describing, in imprecise and sometimes mystical language, effects that modern plasma physics would recognize as real. The intuition preceded the vocabulary, and the vocabulary preceded the institutional acceptance, and the institutional acceptance preceded widespread acknowledgement that the intuition had been right. Markham fits this lineage in certain respects. He's describing effects that, to his knowledge, and by his own admission, he cannot fully explain theoretically. He has observed something. He is reporting what he observed. He is not claiming to know why it works, only that it does. That is, in its way, a scientifically honest position. It is the position of the empiricist who trusts observation over theory when the two conflict. The question of whether what Markham observed is what he thinks it is, whether the vanishing screw went somewhere in time rather than simply failing to be found in space, is separate from the question of whether Markham observed something. The former is unverifiable. The latter is not obviously impossible to believe, given that Markham was building real electrical equipment, drawing real power, and operating in a domain, high-intensity electromagnetic fields, where unusual effects are genuinely documented in the scientific literature, even if they fall short of temporal displacement. What is certain is that the story does not stand alone. It sits within a context of human inquiry, imperfect, passionate, often deluded but sometimes extraordinarily consequential, into the nature of time and space and the possibility that the walls we assume between the past, the present and the future are not as solid as they appear. Markham is one name in a long list of names. The list includes credentialed researchers and self-taught tinkerers, serious physicists and enthusiastic amateurs, people who found nothing and people who found something they could never prove. He is not the first man to claim he touched the edge of time. He may not be the last. But something about his account, that particular persistent texture of quiet seriousness, keeps him in a category by himself. Part 15, the Art Bell Factor. Any serious examination of the Markham case has to contend with the medium through which it was delivered, coast to coast AM, in the era of Art Bell. Art Bell is one of the most significant and most underappreciated figures in the history of American media. From a studio in the Nevada desert, literally in the middle of nowhere, in a small town called Pahrump, he built an audience of millions. At his peak, Coast to Coast AM was heard by somewhere between 15 million and 25 million listeners per week. These numbers put him in the company of the most popular talk radio hosts in the country, which is astonishing given that the subject matter of his show was, by conventional media standards, completely unsaleable. What Bell understood, intuitively, perhaps more than analytically, was that there is an enormous audience for serious engagement with the unexplained. Not mockery, not debunking, not the reassuring condescension of someone explaining why the strange thing you experienced was actually a weather balloon or a psychological episode. Genuine, patient, open-minded engagement. The willingness to sit with a caller for an hour and explore a claim without demanding that it resolve into a comfortable conclusion. This approach created something unusual, a space in American media where people who had experienced or discovered or built something outside the mainstream felt safe saying so publicly. The callers to Coast AM in the Bell era include, alongside the obvious fantasists and attention seekers, a striking number of people who sound like they're telling the truth about something genuinely unusual. They sound like this because Bell's format selects for them. The performative, escalating caller, the one who is there for entertainment, tends to reveal himself quickly through his willingness to be led by audience expectation. The honest caller, the one who is there because he has something real to report, tends to hold his ground when Bell pushes back, tends to acknowledge uncertainty, tends to be more interested in accuracy than impressiveness. Markham falls clearly into the second category. You can hear it in the recordings. When Bell challenges him, he does not double down dramatically. He qualifies. He distinguishes between what he saw and what he interprets it to mean. He says multiple times that he could be wrong about the explanation even if he is certain about the observation. This is not the behaviour of a performer. It is the behaviour of someone who is trying to be taken seriously for legitimate reasons. Bell himself, who was not a credulous man despite his subject matter, or perhaps because of it, treated Markham differently than he treated most callers with spectacular claims. He gave him time, he followed up. He expressed something that, in Bell's careful way, registered as genuine interest rather than entertainment interest. The subtle distinction between those two things is audible in the recordings to anyone who has listened to enough Coast to Coast to calibrate. Bell died in 2018. He never publicly resolved his view of Markham's calls. He mentioned them over the years as something he thought about, as something that stayed with him. That is not a conclusion. But it is a data point from a man who had spent decades listening to thousands of extraordinary claims and had developed a very precise sense of the difference between the ones that held together and the ones that didn't. He thought Markham's held together. Whatever that means, it means something. Part 16. Living outside of time. There is a dimension of Markham's account that gets less attention than the physics or the conspiracy theory, but that may be the most human and the most disturbing aspect of the whole story. Imagine it for a moment. Not the device, not the field, not the distortion. After. Imagine waking up and not knowing when you are. Not where, when. The spatial equivalent, waking up in an unfamiliar place, is disorienting but manageable. You look for landmarks, you ask for directions, you orient yourself relative to things that do not move, mountains, rivers, coastlines, the position of the sun. You may be lost, but lost has a solution. You find your way back. But when? That is different. You cannot look up at the sky and determine the year. There is no compass that points toward the present. You can observe, you can make inferences, you can look at the technology around you and try to date it, look at the fashion, listen to the music, find a newspaper and read the date printed on it. But the newspaper's date tells you where in official chronology you are. It does not tell you how far you are from where you started, because you do not know the exact point you started from in universal terms. You know it in personal terms. You know you were in your garage on a specific afternoon, with specific things on your mind. But personal terms do not map cleanly onto historical chronology when you're trying to measure the distance between 2 points on a timeline from the vantage point of one of them. Markham describes spending months in the unfamiliar time. Months. That is not a brief disorientation. That is an extended experience of being somewhere you're not supposed to be, among people who are living in a moment that is not yours, engaging with a world in which your entire life up to the point of displacement has either not yet happened or has already concluded. Every conversation is a kind of performance. Every relationship is provisional. You cannot build anything real because you know, or believe you know, that you do not belong here and that the project of belonging is a false one. What Markham describes is, if taken seriously, a form of radical homesickness for which there is no word in any language because until the moment it was experienced, it had never been a possible human experience. The longing not for a place but for a time. The ache not for familiar surroundings but for the correct position on the axis of history. The sense of being present and absent simultaneously, physically here, temporally nowhere. And then the question of the return, even if you can build another device, even if the device works, even if you can navigate back to approximately where, when, you came from. What are you going back to? Not exactly the same point. Not exactly the same world. A world that looks like your world, that has the same broad shape as your world, but that differs in ways you will spend the rest of your life noticing and not being able to explain to anyone without sounding like you have lost your mind. Because you cannot say, the world is different because I left it and came back, and the quantum branching of my departure and return has left me in a subtly different timeline. You cannot say that to your family, to your friends, to your doctor, to your neighbours. You say it once, on a radio show, to an audience of millions who will forget most of it, and then you carry the knowledge alone for the rest of your life. That is the human dimension of the Markham story. Whether or not the device worked, whether or not the displacement was real, the experience of believing it, of having lived through something that the available vocabulary of human experience cannot describe, is itself a real thing. And Markham carried it, alone, until the signal stopped. Epilogue, the signal that faded. The recordings of Mike Markham's calls to Coast AM are still out there. They have never been officially addressed, denied, or confirmed by any party with institutional authority. Art Bell referenced them occasionally in later years, with the particular quality of attention he gave to the stories that never fully resolved. Not promotion, not dismissal. but a kind of careful preservation, as if he understood that the story's value lay precisely in its incompleteness. For most people who encounter the Markham story, the comfortable conclusion is the simple one. He was a creative and convincing caller who told a good story, enhanced it over 2 years, and then moved on with his life. Millions of people call radio shows. Most of them disappear into ordinary life afterward. There is nothing suspicious about a caller who stops calling. That explanation is available. It requires the least revision of your existing understanding of the world. It is internally consistent, and it might be right. But something about Markham's account resists it. Not dramatically, not in a way that demands you abandon the sceptical explanation. More quietly than that, the precision of his technical language, the absence of escalation, the return, 2 years later, with a story that does not maximize for entertainment, but instead focuses on the disorienting specifics of what displacement actually felt like. The way he says, "It wasn't the same place I left," as a quiet observation, rather than a dramatic revelation. These are not the signals of performance. They are the signals of honesty. Imperfect, incomplete, unverifiable honesty. The kind that does not have all the answers, because the person giving the account does not have all the answers, and knows it. Somewhere out there, the original recordings sit in their archives. They have been listened to by engineers and physicists and conspiracy researchers and curious insomniacs at 3 a.m. None of them has resolved the question. All of them have walked away with something, an impression, an uncertainty, a nagging sense that the simple explanation is not quite sufficient. That is the thing about Mike Markham. Not that he is certainly telling the truth, not that his device certainly worked, not that time travel is certainly real. The thing about Mike Markham is that you cannot be certain he isn't, and in the universe of anomalous claims, that uncertainty, that small, persistent, irresolvable doubt, is rarer than you think. Most strange stories collapse under scrutiny. They develop internal contradictions. The details shift. The storyteller embellishes. The account drifts from the possible into the clearly impossible, and you feel the ground of plausibility give way beneath it. Markham's account does not do that. It stays stubbornly within the boundaries of the conceivable. It does not ask you to believe in magic. It asks you to believe in a specific, testable, theoretically grounded physical phenomenon that even professional physicists acknowledge they do not fully understand. And then it goes quiet. The signal fades. The man disappears into the noise of time, and you're left with the recordings and the gap where the follow-up should be, and the question that has no answer. What did Mike Markham actually find out there in the field? And whatever it was, wherever it took him, did he ever truly come back? A man built a machine in his garage and accidentally stepped outside of time. That is the story of the caller who came back, or who claimed to, or who was, in some meaningful sense, never quite able to return to the place he left.